Good morning, everyone. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to UCL. Welcome to the Baltic Symposium, the 6th Baltic Symposium, which we hold every 2 years. My name is Robin Esmond. I'm the director of the UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies, where Baltic Studies is based at UCL. It's a real pleasure to welcome you. This is one of the things I look forward to most every 2 years, the Baltic Symposium. We plan it over 18 months leading up to the event, and it's just a great pleasure to work with the embassies, to work with the ministries of your countries, and to work with the community in the UK. It's just really nice. And as evidence of that, the sun's come out this morning. So even though the forecast is for some more heavy rain showers, so I hope you have got your umbrellas at the ready, because in the London weather at the moment it's pretty ferocious when it rains. But nevertheless, the sun's out, so what a nice start to the day. We're really proud, I think is the right word, of the contacts and the relationships and the working relationships we have with Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. And they're very productive and they're very important to us. And I think we give a little bit back, at any rate. Maybe not as much as we receive, but we certainly give a little bit back. And we give that back because we have reinvested at UCL in the last 5 years in the study of the Baltic countries with money from the Provost, that's the head of UCL's strategic fund. We were able to invest in 2 new posts 5 years ago. And we're very, very pleased about that because though we're not the only place that studies the 3 Baltic countries, nevertheless we're the largest institution in the UK and one of the largest in the world, which deals with Central and Eastern Europe, Southeast Europe, the Baltic countries, and Russia. And it's very important to us that we do have expertise on every part of that multifaceted and diverse and interesting and challenging and problematic but wonderful region. And so it was a great pleasure for me when the Provost, as I say, enabled us to reinvest and have new posts and take the study of the Baltic countries forward. We have an ESRC funded workshop seminar series, which is great. We have a visiting scholar scheme with Estonia, and we're about to sign one with Lithuania. So that leaves one country still to join in there, but we're hopeful. It's a great thing for us. For many years we had young scholars coming over from Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania under schemes funded by the Foreign Office, British Council, the countries of the region. But priorities change and the Arab world or China seems more important to the UK at the moment. But for us, no, we don't study the Arab world or China, we study Central and Eastern Europe and the Baltic countries. And so it's very important for us that we've been able to set up these visiting scholar exchanges. And indeed, on Monday, I think it is, or is it Wednesday? No, Wednesday, 25th of April, the visiting scholar from Estonia is giving a seminar at SSEES, the latest visiting scholar. So that's very important to us. What else do we have? Well, Richard Moll's book has just been published by Palgrave Macmillan on the Baltic States. So we're not just welcoming scholars from the Baltic States, we're also publishing leading research of our own. And finally, I'm very pleased to say that we've just, the Vice Provost of UCL, Michael Wharton, and I have just received a grant from the Mellon Foundation of $800,000 for 5 postdocs, 2-year postdocs over the next 6 years, covering all our regions, but there's a good chance that's for language-based interdisciplinary area studies. And let's hope that one of those postdoc scholars will be someone who has a special interest in the Baltic countries. Who knows? Why not? So we're very pleased to hold this symposium. We think UCL is the right place to do it. And it's a pleasure every 2 years to welcome such a distinguished audience, such a distinguished set of participants. It really is a high-profile event, and we're very grateful to the embassies and to the ministries who enable us to make it such a high-profile event. And before I hand over to Her Excellency the Ambassador to introduce our keynote speaker, who, by the way, completed his PhD at SSEES, I would like you to join me in giving a round of applause to the heart and soul, and not to mention the head and the hands of the Baltic Symposium. There are 5 people who, over the years, really make this happen, and they are Alexis Vilchinkas, Irena Hamilton, Catherine Legrand, and from my own office, Christine Fernandez and Rachel Cornby. And so I'd like you to, they really are the heart and the soul and the head and the hands of it, and I'd like you to join me in giving a round of applause. So I think I need to point out to you whoever, I feel like a stewardess or a steward on their thing, the far exits are. They're there and there. And I hope we have a great day. So without more ado, I hand over to Her Excellency the Ambassador to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you. Dear friends of the Baltic countries, I am very proud to be here today, and I'm very grateful to UCL and the committee, and also the Latvian and Lithuanian embassies who have been working hard to make it possible to hold this symposium today. I would like to say a few words about Professor Andres Kasekamp, who is the keynote speaker today. And it is difficult for me to imagine somebody who would be more perfect in this role as keynote speaker on a Baltic Symposium. And one reason for this is, of course, that he has deep knowledge of Baltic history, and the proof of that, of course, is recently published a book called The History of the Baltic States. And it has been published also in Estonian and Latvian, and will soon be published in Polish. But Andres Kasekamp is a professor at the Department of Political Science at Tartu University, and he is also a director of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute in Tallinn. And I mentioned already the book of History of the Baltic States, but he's also editor of the Estonian Foreign Policy yearbooks. There is a long list which I could be speaking there for half an hour, but I will not. But I would like to stress that he's also Vice President of the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies, and in the past he was editor of the Journal of Baltic Studies. So with that few words, I will give the floor to Professor Kasekamp.
Right, I think it's better if I stand here so you can see me. First of all, thank you for those very gracious words of welcome, and it's truly wonderful to be back here at SSEES, where I read for my PhD, and to see many familiar faces here as well. I'm going to talk about Baltic cooperation today and in the past, and where we're at now. I think that's appropriate because we have several sessions here on specific topics, economy, security, culture, and so on. But there's no history panel, so I'll have a little bit of historical background as well, and try to tie in the big picture. When we talk about Baltic cooperation, it hasn't really been a good week for Baltic cooperation, even though we're having this wonderful symposium. The event which has clouded the future of Baltic cooperation 3 days ago was the non-appearance of the Lithuanian president at a summit of 4 Baltic presidents, that is, the Polish president invited the 3 to Warsaw to discuss issues of common concern in the lead-up to the NATO summit in Chicago, and the Lithuanian president announced that this would not be anything new and would be basically a waste of her time. The other presidents who had a little bit further to travel didn't see this as a waste of their time. And as far as I've gathered from my Lithuanian friends and colleagues, that this is not the most constructive way to approach the relationship in the Baltic region. And my Lithuanian friends and colleagues, had they been advising the president of Lithuania, would have probably advised her otherwise. And well, we know that, of course, it had nothing to do with the issue of the NATO summit, though, of course, the diplomatic sources for this whispered that the Poles had intimated that if Lithuania does not become more accommodating on the question of the Polish minority in Lithuania, then Poland might revisit its role or revise its role in the NATO air policing of the 3 Baltic countries. And this was sort of the behind-the-scenes reason, given that the Lithuanian president didn't want to bow to this sort of pressure. But of course, the real issues are buried deep in history, and for most of you who know Lithuanian history well, then it is, of course, a big question of identity between the 2 countries. The specific concrete problems at the moment, of course, are to do with education reform in Lithuania and the ability for the Polish minority in Lithuania to have their names spelt in Polish fashion in Lithuanian official documents. I'm not going to go at all into that controversy, but it's suffice to say here that this debate between 2 important countries of the Baltic Sea region is not very constructive in producing a harmonious relationship around the Baltic Sea. And it's particularly, of course, odd because they are good partners within the EU and NATO. For me personally, it's surprising that the book that Vasi referred to, which I had the pleasure to launch here a year ago, this is one point that I have to revise if it ever goes into a 2nd edition. I did make the point that in the early 90s, Poland and Lithuania agreed to keep their historical differences, put them behind them in the common bid to move forward in the EU and NATO accession process, which appeared to be the case until about 2 years ago, when, surprisingly, these issues returned with a vengeance. And probably many of you have followed Edward Lucas of The Economist has written extensively about this in his blogs and in The Economist and elsewhere recently. But that's just a lead-in to show that Baltic cooperation, which in the widest sense of the Baltic Sea region, which has appeared to be on a progressive forward path all these years, has encountered some setbacks. And it's not, and as an Estonian, it's not something to look upon simply as an observer, but it does have, I think, an impact for larger projects of cooperation which are ongoing or are in the pipeline in the Baltic Sea region, such as Rail Baltica, or the nuclear power plant, the new one in Lithuania, and energy interconnectors, which I think we'll be hearing about later in the security panel. And this sort of negative atmosphere can have a larger impact, and I could say that Estonia and Latvia and our interests could be collateral damage of this Lithuanian-Polish dispute. So it's, of course, an important concern for us as well, and hope that there is some movement in a positive direction on this issue. But that is just an introduction to go back to a little overview of the recent history of Baltic cooperation. And before I come to the most recent past, the newly founded Baltic states after the First World War, together with Finland and Poland, tried to establish some sort of Baltic League. All successor states to the Tsarist Empire, and there were very promising talks in 1920 and up to 1922. The first roadblock, again, was the same that I just began with, that it turned out that in this region we couldn't have an alliance where Poland and Lithuania are in one boat, and that's because the Poles had taken possession of Vilnius, the Lithuanian capital. At that point, of course, the others involved decided that Poland is a much more attractive partner, being an impressively large military power in Central Europe, and they continued without Lithuania. Finally, however, in 1922, this project came to naught when the Finnish parliament rejected it, turning its back on its southern neighbors, and actually, in retrospect, quite wisely, taking a Scandinavian orientation. And there are sort of hints at perhaps that Estonia was perhaps following that same example a bit in the late 90s, which I'll come to. So we ended up in the first period of independence was the narrowest, most minimal version of Baltic cooperation, initially, which was a defensive alliance between Estonia and Latvia, sealed in 1923. And that was followed up in 1934 by a Baltic entente between Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, but this was lacking a military dimension. It only had diplomatic consequences, semi-annual meetings of the foreign ministers, and it didn't really support Lithuania in the issues that mattered most. The Baltic Entente was only possible because it excluded the issues of Vilnius and Klaipėda, or Memel, where Lithuania would have wanted Estonian and Latvian support. And in the end, of course, in 1939, 1940, as a consequence of the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, Baltic cooperation didn't save us from disaster. And Baltic cooperation has been criticized as really a non-starter. But of course, I think that's holding the bar quite high, in the sense that you can't think of too many other successful regional cooperation models in interwar Europe. And as compared to Baltic cooperation today, the circumstances and conditions were much less favorable. Whereas most of our neighbors, Western Europe at least, and Scandinavia, has done everything to promote and favor Baltic cooperation or regional cooperation in the last 20 years during the interwar period of independence, then Germany, Soviet Union, and Poland all worked to undermine any sort of Baltic entente. So that external factor was certainly as important to the failure of the project as the internal, perhaps, unwillingness. And ironically, one could say that this Baltic identity and Baltic cooperation really comes to the fore once these countries have been wiped off the map in the Second World War. And in the Soviet Union, then they're finally seen as one bloc, a pre-Baltica, and from the outside world as well. And this is solidified in the drive towards independence. In the late 80s, early 90s, our famous singing revolution, and the ultimate symbol of Baltic cooperation, the Baltic Way, or the Baltic Chain, the nearly 2 million people who joined hands from Tallinn via Riga down to Vilnius, stretching more than 600 kilometers on the 50th anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact on the 23rd of August, 1989. So in the struggle for independence, the Balts found each other again. When they achieved their independence, then they tended to go their own way again, which is only, I suppose, natural. Having fought hard to re-establish their independence, they savored it, and each wanted to go their own direction. Nevertheless, of course, these formal institutions of cooperation were built up in this period of the early 1990s. The Baltic Parliamentary Assembly, the Baltic Council of Ministers, and larger regional groupings like the Council of Baltic States, which were all founded in the early 90s. But the fact that the Baltic states were all busy building up their own re-established states and focusing on their own problems, I think is something that we can accept as only natural at that moment. They were also, in many senses, competitors economically, competing for the same foreign direct investment, trying to sell their goods to similar markets, and not having that much to offer to each other, even though they did manage in the mid-90s to sign a free trade agreement amongst themselves. Though they did also manage to have disputes over fishing rights and maritime borders as well. A big watershed in this progress towards Baltic cooperation was 1997, when the European Union invited only Estonia to begin accession negotiations for European Union membership. This was at the time seen as a big blow for Baltic solidarity and Baltic cooperation. And of course there were occasional hints by Estonian politicians that if they have to choose between continued Baltic cooperation, free trade, and so on, then, well, we're not going to let that stop us from getting into the EU. So there were some uncomfortable signs that Estonia was prepared to go it alone. But at that point, of course, what was important was differentiation, because the EU accession model at that point wasn't the big bang which we ended up with, but it was what was referred to at the time as the regatta model, that everyone crosses the finish line, every candidate country crosses the finish line at its own pace, at its own merits. That was the original conception, and therefore Estonia was constantly worried that it was invited first because it had had the most radical free market reforms already in the 90s, because it had elected a fresh government in the 90s, which had no connections to the past, unlike the Lithuanian case, of course, which was the Lithuanians being the first to re-elect the successor party to the former communists back into power. So the Estonians took the shock therapy route, whereas the Lithuanians tried to spread out the pain and have a more gradual approach. And the European Commission noticed this, and Estonia then began to emphasize its differences and tried to downplay the fact that it was Baltic. And of course, at that point, there were also conflicts in the Balkans, and it wasn't unusual that an anchor person on CNN would confuse the conflict in the Balkans with the Baltics. I had a student in Tartu, an American student in the late 90s who told me that he got a phone call from a friend or a relative in the States who had asked, can they hear the gunfire from where he is in Tartu? This is the time of the Kosovo crisis. So this sometimes still happens, and it's and of course the Balkans was not really a brand that one wanted to be associated with. And the Baltics also didn't necessarily have that many positive connotations to it in the 90s. Often if you thought of the Baltics, then it was, I know something about, those are the countries where they discriminate against the Russian minority. Or that's the place where they haven't yet come to terms with the Holocaust. So these, the Baltic image was something that Estonia tried to shed, and Nordic was this shining star that we strove for. A little bit like I mentioned in the beginning how Finland took the Scandinavian orientation in the 20s and 30s. And of course it was a Nordic quality of life, and the Nordic countries being very progressive. And we thought, as Estonians, that there is a good case, linguistic affinity with the Finns, and all sorts of statistical indicators about high internet usage and mobile phone usage and so on. Didn't mention some of the common features, negative ones, such as suicide rates and divorce rates and things like that, which also bring us together with those on the western side of the Baltic Sea. But anyhow, we tried to go in that direction, or rebrand ourselves. This was important to differentiate because the fear was that we would be sort of held back by the Baltics to be seen as one group, and from the Brussels perspective, they would not accept anyone until the weakest or the slowest in terms of economic reforms would be on board, which would be an excuse for leaving us all out of the picture. And as you recall, we were, of course, in the most fragile position of all of the candidate countries, because we still have that red line of the former Soviet Union, where Western institutions shouldn't be crossing into. And of course, the consequence of having been in the Soviet Union, we were the poorest of the candidate countries. So we didn't have much going for us at that point. So we had to try that much harder. At that point, the Lithuanians did something quite similar to the Estonians in the other direction. They started promoting their Central European identity, because the other enlargement that was going on in the accession process, besides for the EU, was NATO. And here the Lithuanians had a case that they were best prepared for joining NATO. They had invested more into their military reforms, and importantly, they were also a direct neighbor to a NATO country, Poland, whereas Estonia looked far away, difficult to defend. And in this case, Estonians had no problems claiming to be Baltic behind the Lithuanians, but the Lithuanians, of course, were claiming to be Central Europeans because we'd already had the Central European round, or the Visegrad round of NATO expansion a few years earlier. Problem here, of course, is where does that leave Latvia? If you have one Nordic and one Central, then you have one truly Baltic country, which is Latvia in the center. And I think, to terribly simplify things, that this partly accounts for, of course, why we end up with the Big Bang enlargement with both organizations in parallel taking on all of these countries at once. Now, in the remaining time, the situation after enlargement of both the EU and NATO in 2004. Well, on the one hand, there's been incentive for more cooperation being in these two organizations. And I neglected to say just a moment ago that, of course, there was some external pressure counteracting what I had just been describing about the Estonian and Lithuanian desires to go solo in the EU and NATO directions, respectively. Particularly in the NATO accession, there was external pressure for the Baltic states to demonstrate their maturity and preparedness to join the big league by, first of all, showing that they can cooperate amongst themselves. And this was sort of a test of maturity for them to demonstrate that. And that pressure worked very effectively in the NATO case. And probably most of you are familiar with all of these acronyms that came out of that period of the late 90s. BALT-BAT, BALT-DEFCOL, BALTTRON, all these joint Baltic, starting with the joint Baltic peacekeeping battalion, most of which have been quite successful. But they were all led by one of our Western allies. So it was that external factor which I would argue played a large role in keeping cooperation between us on track at that time. Because while our own institutions were in place, there wasn't, I'd say, great enthusiasm for cooperation amongst ourselves. We realized the practical nature of it, but given a choice, an Estonian would probably want to hang out with the Finns or the Swedes in preference. And Rein Taagepera once said this, Professor Rein Taagepera, at a Baltic conference, that he called this, I think very aptly, that there's a lack of what he called a Baltic emotion. That we realize that we're in the same boat. Destiny has put us there, but there isn't always that sort of emotional tie that we seek to be together and do things naturally together and seek each other's company. Now, inside the EU, of course, there has been much reason to work together, but of course the EU isn't completely composed of regional blocs. There are all these various dossiers or issues where we might have differences of emphasis or priorities. One thing which has helped but hasn't really given us much results yet is the EU Baltic Sea strategy, which is a wonderful thing, but it doesn't come with its own funding. That's, of course, why it was possible for the EU to reach agreement in creating this in 2009. It's, of course, an experiment. It's the first sort of this regional strategy of its kind, and now there's a Danube strategy in the pipeline following the Baltic Sea strategy. But it's basically an umbrella or a label where you can hook on your individual projects and hope to create synergy by them. But it doesn't have its own pot of money or its own budget line behind that. But there again, it's important in creating a larger Baltic community that we're here talking about the three Baltic states in the classic sense, but of course more and more, particularly in the world of economics, these interactions across the sea in the Baltic Sea region forming is most important. And in this respect, I think the key will be in the future whether the Poles and the Germans recognize themselves to be part of this Baltic Sea region or not, because Nordic-Baltic cooperation seems to be working quite well and has been working well since the 90s. It's 5+3 model, 5 Nordic countries, 3 Baltic countries. But the heavyweights who are part of the Baltic Sea region, Poland and Germany, seems to me haven't really realized that they are also Baltic Sea countries. The Poles, I think, are coming a bit more around to this recently. Now, for some of the big projects in our region at the moment, I mentioned already in the beginning these big infrastructure projects. One that's most important for Estonia, which what we're emphasizing is Rail Baltica, which should be a high-speed train line that goes from Tallinn through Riga, through Vilnius to Warsaw and eventually to Berlin, and also hooking up by ferry, hopefully, to Helsinki. This would be the biggest, most expensive Baltic cooperation project ever. 3 prime ministers have all agreed upon this, but of course there's difficulties when we come to the details. It seems that occasionally our Latvian friends, or at least some who are influenced by the Lemberg's political forces, seem to be much more interested in a rival project, which would be, rather than north-south, would be east-west, a express line Moscow Riga, which you could see might have some potential for Latvia in terms of cargo. However, of course, our friends in Moscow would like the Latvians to secure European funding for this, which will never happen. Particularly since the Commissioner for Transport in the European Union is an Estonian in the moment. See Kallas. And this is of course the hope that this project might, the Rail Baltica, might succeed, because there is a strong political will, and also our man in Brussels who's pushing this, hopefully. Other projects, a nuclear power plant which has been to replace Ignalina, which was closed down as part of the Lithuania's EU accession obligations back in 2009. That has, of course, gone much slower than anyone has hoped for. It's gone through various modifications. Poland was brought into the project. Poland is no longer in the project. It should be a joint project between Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And in the meantime, well, there's competing projects have arisen. One in Belarus right next door, and a Russian one in Kaliningrad, both of which are not necessary for their own domestic reasons, and which many Lithuanians suspect are purely projects to demotivate investors into the Lithuanian project, which seems like a fairly rational explanation. But nevertheless, the Lithuanian project, where Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania should be equal partners in this, of course the Lithuanians are lead partners, has run into all sorts of difficulties. Now I understand that the Social Democrats, who will be the next, probably the next government in Lithuania, are also in favor of this idea of a referendum, which, and if you ask the people about nuclear issues, then that's never really, well, that's a sure way to get a negative answer. In the meantime, it's meant Estonians, out of frustration at the pace of the project, have even come up with their own, to my mind, rather absurd idea of let's build our own nuclear power plant for ourselves, which I don't think is a particularly good idea, but it's sort of a measure of how cooperation sometimes isn't working. And finally, since my time is coming to an end, there's also, again, in the big projects in the energy sector, big money is there, of course, is the LNG terminals, the liquefied natural gas, which is, of course, meant to lessen our dependence on Russia and to ensure that Gazprom lowers its prices. And here again, there was a big start to having one terminal for the whole region. It's an expensive investment. And now it looks like everyone is going their own direction. And we'll have one in Klaipėda, we'll have a Latvian one, and in the Estonian case, there are several competing Estonian companies who want to bid on having an Estonian terminal. And of course, the Estonians, being Estonians, want to get the Finns involved, but the Finns aren't interested in this typical story.